Hello, my name is Yukie Nagai. I'm working at the University of Tokyo. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present our work. The title of my talk is Development of Perception, Action, and Learning. In the last decade, we have been closely investigating the roles of predictive coding as a unified account for human cognitive development. I'd like to share with you our latest research achievement and then discuss how our result can be extended to better account for the underlying mechanism for affective shared perception. We know from developmental studies that human children acquire various cognitive abilities in the first few years of life. Here, their perception and action and learning are closely interlinked to drive the cognitive development. Here, the open question is, what neural mechanism underlies the cognitive development? Is there a unified principle for accounting for the continuity and also the diversity in the development? As a plausible mechanism, we have been closely looking at the predictive coding theory, which has been suggested as a unified account for the human brain. The neuroscientist has been suggesting that our human brain works as a predictive machine, and it tries to minimize the prediction errors. Yet the prediction errors are calculated as a difference between the top-down prediction from the internal model and the bottom-up sensory signal. For example, when you perceive the world, you receive the sensory signals from vision, audio, tactile, and so on. But you don't simply rely on the incoming sensory signal, but you apply their predictions based on their previous experiences. And then this predicted signal is integrated with the incoming sensory signal to either update the internal model or to make their posterior as a perception. And interestingly, their action generation is also explained in the same way. Here, the motor output is updated using the prediction error, the discrepancy between their proprioceptive signal and their predicted proprioceptive signals. And the important hypothesis here is that the process of integrating the top-down predictions and the bottom-up sensations follows the Bayesian inference loop. Here, the prior is represented as the yellow Gaussian distribution with some variances, indicating how precise the prior is. And the sensory signal is represented as a red Gaussian distribution, which also has some noises. And the posterior is created by integrating the top-down prior and the bottom-up sensory signals based on their variances. This is a very nice good account, the unified account to explain how the human brain perceives the world and act on the world. But still an open question is how this predictive processing is acquired over the development. So to address this question, we have been conducting mainly two studies. One is the computational modeling. We developed a neural network model which simulates the human predictive processing, and then examined to what extent their differences in the neural network model could explain the different levels of the development. And the second study is the behavior analysis of the human children. We directly assessed the human child behaviors and then analyzed their behaviors based on the predictive coding theory. We presented these two studies in the last year and this year's ICDL conference. So if you are interested in the detail, you can have a look at our papers. So let's go to the first study. It's in a computational modeling. As a predictive coding-based neural network model, we extended the network, so-called stochastic continuous time recurrent neural network model. This network has an important function to predict not only the mean of their sensory signal, but also the variance of the sensory signal. This variance indicates uncertainty of the predictions. And then this uncertainty is also utilized for the Bayesian inference. This predicted signal is used as a flyer, and then they are integrated with the incoming sensory signal based on the Bayesian inference. And the posteriors are utilized as an input for the context layer. So the network is learned to minimize the prediction error. And with this network, we hypothesized that the aberrant precisions in the predictions may account for different immaturity in the cognitive development. For example, this is a normal flyer, but then we can manipulate the model parameters to generate like a hyper flyer or hypo flyer. There are several model parameters which can directly control the variance of the predictions. So we tested to what extent this change in the flyer predictions would affect the different immaturities of their prediction ability. So this is the first experiment. We introduced the drawing behaviors as a cognitive task. This is the training data. We designed 6 different types of drawing, like face, house, car, and so on. We first trained the network to reproduce these 6 different patterns through the back propagation through time. And then after the training, we let the network to infer the intended patterns of the trajectories by giving only the first 33% of the trajectories. And then let the network to complete the missing parts. For example, here the eyes and mouth are missing, so the network had to complete the eyes and mouth. This is the videos of their drawing. You can see how their trajectory look like. The yellow line indicates the incoming sensory signal to the network. And the black line is the output for the existing lines. And then the green line showing their predictions by the network, where the no incoming signal exists. And our research question here is that how this drawing behavior will be affected by the modulations of the flyer prediction. We manipulated the parameter h to control the precision of the predictions, and then observed how the modification of h would affect the immaturity of the drawing behavior. So this is the first result. We first looked at the behavioral level, the modification. We modified the parameter h from the very low value corresponding to hyperparameter to very high value corresponding to the hypoparameter. First, let's have a look at the normal flyer. In case of normal flyer, we could observe that the network was very successful in completing the missing parts. For most cases, the network could add their missing features, like an eyes, mouth, or window or door for the house. Then the interesting findings first observed from their hyperflyers. In case of hyperflyer, the network often misinterpreted the intended pattern. For example, this was intended for their car, but then the network was confused with their face. Maybe this is because the outlines of their face and car were similar to each other. That's why the network was confused with the 2 patterns. Or another case is the rocket. This was similar to human, so that's why the outline, the outcomes of the network was also get closer to the human pattern. And by comparing with the hypo-flyer network, we can further gain the insight into the neural network behaviors. In case of hypopliers, we observed that network first traced the existing line and then starts scribbling once the incoming sensory signal disappears. The similar patterns observed for all different types of the categories. So it's nicely showing that there are different difficulties or immaturity in the drawing behaviors could be generated by the hypoplier. We could observe also the statistical differences between the normal and hyperpliers. So you can see the U-shaped curve here for the prediction errors of different plier network. This is a very interesting behavioral outcomes. But why this happens? What the neural network, the representation look like? Then we analyzed the internal representation of the recurrent neural network. By applying the principal component analysis to the context neurons, we visualized the neural activations while drawing their 3 different patterns, as an example here. The top row showing the neural activation for the first 30 steps, responding to their timing where the incoming sensory signal existed. And then the bottom panel shows the neural activations for the period when the network did not receive any incoming signal. And by looking at first the normal plier network, you can observe that the 3 different objects were nicely separated in their neural activation. Here, the red corresponds to face and yellow corresponds to house. These 2 are a little bit overlapped, but this is because of the similarities between the outlines. These similarities between the outlines strongly impacted the internal representation of hyperplier network. You can see that the yellow and the red trajectories are completely overlapping. This is because the network had hyperplier, suggesting that the network strongly relied on its own internal dynamics. So the different patterns, slightly different patterns could be easily attracted to the stronger input patterns. That's why the house or cars are often misinterpreted as a face. And then if you go to the hyperplier network, you can see quite different immaturity in the drawing behavior. We could not observe any plier here, no attractors, suggesting that how difficult for this network to produce their missing parts, which resulted in a scribbling behavior. Okay, so this is our first computational modeling experiment. So what happens in the real human child? We conducted a very similar study with human children, aged from 2 to 8 years old. We used a tablet displaying their features, the part of the features of their figures, and then asked children to draw something that whatever they like. We have collected 621 drawing patterns, and you can see some example here. For example, that some children showed the scribbling behaviors or sometimes the coloring behaviors. And we also could observe another type, which is a tracing, that some children just traced that existing trajectories. And then, of course, we could observe the completion abilities. For your interest, we can also show there some behaviors result from the adults. The adults were also very creative, so you can see there are many different types of completion patterns. So we analyzed their developmental changes using their 2 methods. The first method was the subjective evaluation by the adult rater. We asked the adult evaluators to assess their developmental change in their completion ability. In our experiment, we had 3 conditions with different difficulties. One is the outline condition, only the contours of the figures were given, or inner feature condition, only the inner parts were given, or scrambled inner feature conditions, where the configurations was not given anymore. We expected that scrambled in a feature condition would be more difficult for children. But actually, we could not observe so much differences between the conditions, but rather we observed very nicely their linear improvement in their comprehension ability, regardless of their different conditions. So first, our conclusion is that their perceptual inference ability and also the active inference ability, which corresponded to their proving behaviors, nicely there develops with the age, which this score is nicely supporting the hypothesis. And then we further examined how the different categories are created as appliers. By analyzing their drawing patterns using the convolutional neural network, we quantitatively evaluated how the different objects were separated or not separated each other. This is the structure of the deep convolutional neural network we used. We used this network, which has their pre-trained using their natural image. And then we looked at their activation of the highest layer of of this network when we fed their drawing patterns to this network. And this matrix shows the similarities or dissimilarities between the neural activations when we provided the different input figures. Darker color indicating that the two categorical different figures are close to each other, whereas the yellow color indicating that two objects were separated, differentiated to each other. So you can see that from younger age to older age, gradually these categorical representations were acquired. And finally, the older children was acquiring their very similar pattern to the adults. This again showing that how the different categorical representation as a player of the brain is acquired over the development. We nicely demonstrated that the younger children start with undifferentiated clusters, and then it gradually and properly separated as they develop. So these are the two studies we conducted. So what we can learn from these two studies, what are the insight we could gain? In the first computational study, we designed a different player network. And what we observed is that depends on the precision of the player, the network behaviors differ very significantly. With the normal player, the network was very successful in completing the missing parts, whereas Hypo or hyperplayers network, the network were less successful. And interestingly, we found that very similar behavioral patterns from human children. From older children, we could observe the completion ability, this. And then, similar to the hyperplayer network, we observed that the younger children tend to do the scribbling or tracing behaviors. So one conclusion from our experiment is that the developmental process is explained as a process to change from hypo to normal player networks. With less experiences, the precision of player is still low. So that's why the accumulations of the experiences would significantly impact on the higher precision in the player. What happens for the hyperplayer? We found the very interesting and corresponding behavior result from children. Although these were not dominant, we found that some children stick to their preferred patterns. For example, one boy often drew a flower regardless of the input signal, or another boy often drew their configuration of their figures or geometric figures regardless of the input signal. So we think that these patterns can be nicely explained by the hyperplayer as their own preferences. Once they acquire their strong player, they often stick to this prior regardless of the input signal. So although this is still their hypothetical idea, but we suggest that their different immaturity can be accounted for by their hyperpriors, the network. But then, of course, there are several open questions. The one question is whether is there any other potential mechanism that can account for the different immaturities. For example, the outcomes of the hyperprior can be explained not only by this hyperplier, but also hypo sensation. We know that the human children, especially the young children, have less acuity in the sensation. And then less acuity here is represented as a larger their Gaussian distributions. This resulted in the similar posteriors with their hyperplier network. So maybe another potential, the hypothesis or underlying mechanism can be the hyposensation for the biased or preferred patterns. Another interesting hypothesis is that the outcomes of the hypoprior can be accounted not only by this mechanism, but also multiple priors. If the children tend to acquire different multiple priors, which are very task or the context specific, then their outcomes also biased to the sensory signal. So now we started more closely investigating which the hypothesis can be better account for the different immaturity in the development. Now we started again the computational study to more closely look at the internal mechanism. And another interesting open question is, of course, the affective shared perception. So Dr. Alessandra Schutti already shown that the social context affects the predictive processing. They introduced the ICAP to examine how this social partner affects the human's perception. And they found that this social context impact on the human perception, and especially the participants started relying significantly less on the prior experiences in the interaction context. So it means that in case of the social robot conditions, the humans more closely looked at the incoming sensory signals and relied on the incoming sensory signal compared to the individual non-social condition. Based on this result, they suggest that in the social context, the incoming sensory signal from the partner would be more important. That's why the participant paid stronger attention to the incoming sensory signal. This is very inspiring, and we actually started a similar experiment, but here I have the additional hypothesis which can better explain the underlying neural mechanism. My focus is on the neurotransmitter. For example, we know that the dopamine has an important role in our learning and perceptions. You may know that the dopamine is closely related to the pleasure and motivations. So when we have the pleasure feeling, the dopamine is more generated. A recent study suggests that the dopamine also controls the precisions or saliences of the incoming sensory signal. For example, this figure showing that the increase of the dopamine also increases the precisions of the incoming sensory signal, which result in the stronger reliance on the sensory input. And interestingly, it also suggested that the hyper or hypo activation of the dopamine can induce the neurological disorders like a Parkinson's disease and schizophrenia. So based on these findings, we have been suggesting, or we now hypothesize that the social context would first modulate the neurotransmitters. And then this neurotransmitter would change the precisions of the sensory incoming signal, which resulted in the stronger reliance on the incoming sensory signal. This is still a very hypothetical idea, but in collaboration with the physiologist, we plan to conduct the experiment to investigate the relationship between the predictive coding and their neurotransmitter and also the hormones in the humans. And also for the technical side, we just started implementing our neural network model into ICAP to conduct their affective social perception or drawing the representation. Here, the robot is using the recurrent neural network, which was used in our previous study, and then tries to first infer the intended figure presented by the persons and then producing the output of the network. You can also see here their activation of their internal, the neural network. This is a camera view from the robot side. You can see how differently the robot would react depends on the plier. With the normal plier, robot was very successful in completing the missing parts, whereas with Hypo plier, robot did the scribbling like in young children's. For the sake of simplicity, here the drawing lines were directly produced by the network output. So the robot does not really draw on the touch display. But with this experimental setting, we think that the affective, the shared perception can be nicely examined in the future. So now we are very much looking forward to start the human-robot interaction experiment by using this experimental setting. Let me conclude. So in my talk, I presented the idea of predictive coding as a unified neural mechanism for perception, action, and learning. As you know, the predictive coding provides a very nice explanation for the different types of the behaviors. But here we now closely looked at how the predictive processing is acquired over the development. And we found out that well-balanced predictive processing is the outcomes of the development. But then in the younger childhood, the children may have their different top-down predictions and bottom-up sensation, the imbalances. So then we are now still conducting their further experiments to better integrate our findings and also to further investigate the underlying neural mechanism, not only the differences in prior, but also the sensations. I hope that in the next ICDO meeting, we can show you the next new achievement to integrate their neurotransmitter, hopefully. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And I'd like to especially thank Dr. Anja Philipsen. She conducted the most of my studies in my talk. Thank you very much.